New Marvel Snap Season 2 new Marvel Snap card releases. Let's go ahead and dive into our best decks roundup and see what people are using to get back to Infinite. Surtur is the new toy on the block, and naturally, our most popular deck this week is leveraging the Season Pass card. While there's a lot of variations of these 10 plus power things leveraging Surtur, they pretty much all contain the card Scar, and most of them contain things like Armor, Cosmo, and Shadow King, since a mixture of protecting your big threats while simultaneously kicking over your opponent's carefully built sandcastles is quite powerful in Marvel Snap. In my experience playing with variations of this archetype, the Typhoid Mary buff in our recent OTA, so she only impacts just her lane, is such an incredible upgrade for it, making it so you can play her out and other 10 power things in different lanes. Means we consistently get Scar down to 0 energy with decks like this, thanks to both Surtur and Zabu, making it so we can play some of these 4 energy cards ahead of curve. As far as higher series cards go, I'll say that Cull Obsidian and Scar feel most important for this deck to operate at a competitive level. While Nico Minaru is nice to have, she's more utility and can be substituted out for a different 1 energy play, such as Nightcrawler or Ant-Man, to help enable Cull being played around the board. Moving along to our top performers on the way back to Infinite, we kick things off with Sarah Control, aka Sandcastle Kicker Extraordinaire. This deck list is ready to disrupt whatever your opponent has going on with its mixture of Shadow King, Rogue, Killmonger, and Red Guardian. The Invisible Woman is a notable call out in this deck list because you can hide your tech cards behind it, so they always reveal after the game has finished, meaning managing priority becomes a bit less important, especially with Killmonger. Also noteworthy that Hitmonkey loves being tucked under Invisible Woman. If you play it there earlier in the game, he'll count all of the cards that you play on turn 6, letting you scale it up even larger. One of the biggest strengths about this deck is that even when your disruptive cards don't line up ideally into your opponent, the mixture of Hitmonkey, Agent Venom, Gwenpool, and Bishop allow you to get pretty consistently solid numbers onto the board. As far as higher series must-haves, I do think those 3 cards I just listed that help you make numbers are the must-haves for this deck, i.e. Agent Venom, Gwenpool, and Hitmonkey. I think Red Guardian and even US Agent can be substituted to a degree. Red Guardian swaps for another 3 energy tech card like Mobius or Luke Cage, and US Agent could definitely be Maximus in a pinch. Our second top performer on the way back to Infinite is Bounce featuring Toxin. This deck list just consistently pumps out really solid numbers, and outside of the event of Invisible Woman ruining your day with good play, this archetype tends to be fairly solid at managing priority and ducking tech cards like Killmonger and Shadow King. I think it's also worth noting that because this deck is good at dodging priority, it also makes it an excellent candidate for clearing lots of cubes from bots on your way back to Infinite, because the way you're most likely to get maximum cube payout from an AI opponent is having very little power on the board going into the 6th turn of the game. I think this deck list is actually pretty flexible on its higher series cards, with Toxin being the only mechanically unique one that's tough to replace because we're already playing the other 2 bounce cards in the game. Agent Venom and Hitmonkey can substitute for things like Sage or Collector that add more stats to the board for you. Black Swan can substitute for another card that gives you extra energy, such as Wiccan or Hope Summers. And Silver Sable and Nico Minaru can swap out for things like Hawkeye or Spider-Ham that play out as other 1 energy plays. Our last deck in the top performing category is the Agent Venom Cosmo Good Stuff deck. This list is just hyper efficient at putting stats into play, with Iron Man and Mystique Iron Man or Claw spreading them all around in tandem with Agent Venom powering up our starting low power things. I will say this deck list really isn't budget friendly. I think most of the high series cards in here are pretty mechanically unique and don't really have clean replacements if they're missing in your collection. First up in our high potential category, we have Frigga Bounce Movers. For those that haven't watched my deck roundups before, high potential decks are lists that have really impressive stats on untapped so far, but they have smaller sample sizes, so I'm not confident enough to say that they are a top performer. But these decks could be the next breakout thing if their metrics stay strong while their sample size grows. Frigga inside of this bounce move deck seems like a phenomenal way to solve one of the problems that this archetype often has, which is how do you win a second lane? One of these move deck's biggest issues is that you only have 3 payoffs in Human Torch, Dagger, and Vulture, and the games where you don't draw 2 of those 3 payoffs often are very difficult to win. With Frigga, you can draw only 1 payoff, bounce it back to your hand, and then copy it with Frigga to deploy it down to a second lane at the end of the game. This deck list is also pretty budget unfriendly, unfortunately. Anya and Madam Web are pretty unique move enablers that are Series 5 and don't really have great replacements, and Frigga is another new mechanically unique card that I think is a fantastic addition here that you really need to have. Our next high potential deck list is Anti-Venom Pixie. I actually used this deck list to pick up a new Infinite border with last season in Conquest. It's also got really solid stats on the ladder so far to start the new one off. This deck list is just doing a ton of objectively powerful stuff while also being brutal in the amount of interaction it has for the opponent. Luke Cage, Mobius and Mobius, Alioth, Shadow King, Man-Thing, and even Lady Deathstrike are all cards that can win individual matchups on the spot, completely blowing your opponent out. And then when you add Anti-Venom into the mix alongside Luke Cage and Shadow King, having any of these cards completely for free while also getting the power on them is very powerful. The cherry on top of all this is that Pixie can make these cards randomly very cheap as well, and your output range is incredibly difficult for your opponent to play around, giving you a lot of cube equity in a deck like this. Replaceable higher series cards in this deck are definitely Hydra, Bob, and Copycat, with Bob easily subbing out for another 1 energy play. Copycat could be another generically good 3 energy card like Red Guardian, but I also think there's probably merit to playing a third 1-drop in this deck to make your Pixie rolls a little bit more consistent. Our next high potential deck list is a good stuff disruptive list that we really haven't seen be good in Marvel Snap in a little while. There's no real fancy synergies or complex deck building here. It's just cards that have good stat lines for their energy costs like Speed and Red Hulk, while also having a spread of quality disruption with things like Spider-Ham, Shadow King, Rogue, and Mobius and Mobius. I think if this deck list or something close to it is good in Marvel Snap, the format's probably in a pretty solid spot. That being said, this deck list is also definitely a Wallet Warrior's dream, with almost all of our cards being higher series ones that are kinda unique in what they do. Our last high potential deck list today is an Anti-Venom Misery Mill deck. Yondu, Cable, and Gladiator are looking to take all of the cards away from your opponent's deck and either destroy them to make your death cheaper or give you utility with them with Cable. Misery also excels alongside Killmonger at making our death extra cheap. And then we round out the last few slots in this shell with cards like Shang-Chi and Legion being incredibly disruptive to your opponent's game plan. To close things out with a couple of my own personal picks that I've been playing on the way back to Infinite, we have a Frigga Anti-Venom Ajax deck. The idea here is relatively straightforward. Ajax is our heavy hitter that we set up with either Hazmat in a big flourish or Death by 1,000 paper cuts, with things like Scorpion, Cassandra Nova, and Man-Thing and US Agent all adding up over the course of the game. I think Scorpion in particular is a really quality metagame card, with everybody trying to play Surtur right now, cutting off their bonuses by reducing their 10s down to just 9s. Anti-Venom with Frigga is the really potent setup here. You can copy your 0 energy card that Luke Cage is going to make sure has stats on the last turn of the game. Frigga's not just a one-trick in this deck, though. Copying Silver Sable, Cassandra Nova, and even US Agent is frequently good in a number of spots, as these are all cards that can swing matchups, especially if we get a second copy of them. Finally, we have a fun and unique take on Hitmonkey featuring Strong Guy and Blade as an additional way to put numbers on the table. I think the way you can build these Hitmonkey Agent Venom decks is pretty wide. We featured the bounce version earlier, that's a top performer, but this build has also felt really strong in my experience playing it, while also being a little bit more straightforward and linear to play. If you're someone that needs a break from brain melting bounce lines, this deck list has a lot of the good things that bounce has going for it, with a little bit simpler sequencing decisions, which is nice when you want to still play your animals with guns but your brain is a little fried. Honestly, I've really been enjoying the start to the Marvel Snap season. Surtur is definitely a powerful and playable card, and it's going to cement Scar as being a real card in the metagame at long last. Frigga feels like she's probably a bit lower than Surtur in terms of power level, but she still seems solidly playable, and she's a pretty unique effect. I think if you're missing any of the other cards in the Spotlight cache this week, it's an easy pickup, and if you're someone who's flush with resources, I think you'll find plenty of spots to play Frigga where she's not replaceable, like the decks that we highlighted today. As always, I'd love to know what you're finding success with in Marvel Snap in the comments down below. And remember, if you want to see me playing a bunch of these decks, be sure to check out my daily deck highlights channel linked in the video description, where you can find me posting a different Marvel Snap deck with gameplay 7 days a week.